Hello everyone, Professor Kusluch here. So I wanted to make a video just wrapping up our Administering Elections book, particularly Chapter 5, which focuses on pluralism, political participation, and third-party group. So we saw from this reading, from this book, that elections are maybe a bit more complex, or at least have more working pieces and moving pieces than we oftentimes think about when we think of elections in the US. So earlier chapters talked about how the apparatus, the mechanism of elections itself works. Chapter 5 looks at pluralism, political participation, and third-party groups. So pluralism is one of the core theoretical foundations of American political science. At its most basic level, as we saw from the reading, pluralism asserts that politics is not the domain of isolated individuals, but instead organized groups. Individuals rarely act alone. Instead, they aggregate their interests through associations, which might be unions, trade groups, nonprofit organizations, advocacy networks. And together, these organized groups, these associations, collectively articulate demands to the government. And we talked about why. There's power, and we'll get into it here, but why people would join these organizations. So as Robert Dahl, remember he makes an appearance in all of our reading, as Robert Dahl argued, democracy in a pluralist system operates like an open marketplace of ideas. Competing organizations vie for influence, and the resulting balance of power reflects the really dynamic interplay of social forces. This theory assumes that no single actor can dominate the system indefinitely because political power is widely distributed. Now, we know from some of our earlier readings, from readings 2-3 weeks ago, that there are a lot of criticisms of this system. But it is worth thinking about and reading about so we have a fuller understanding of what these arguments are. So let's think first about third-party groups. We spent a lot of time in class thinking about and talking about third-party groups, but let's just make sure we are all on the same page here. So third-party organizations have been involved in election reform, administration since really the late 19th century. Many emerged in response to the perceived corruption and inefficiencies of early American political parties. One of the earliest examples from our reading is the Union League of Chicago, founded in 1879, advocated for professionalized registration systems and measures to combat fraud. Initiatives that foreshadowed the modern administrative state's role in election oversight. So the authors also talk about the League of Women Voters, which represents perhaps the most enduring and influential example of civic engagement in electoral administration. The LWV, was formed in 1920 out of the suffrage movement. The League's founders understood that formal enfranchisement was only one step towards substantive participation. So throughout the 20th century, the LWV pursued reforms such as permanent voter registration lists, standardized ballots, and voter education campaigns. In the early 1920s, its Victory Vote Drive, a national initiative that included radio broadcasts, door-to-door outreach, and public events, helped normalize the idea that elections were a civic responsibility, requiring both institutional and civic engagement. By mid-century, the League had become a recognized intermediary between the public and election administrators, embodying this pluralistic notion that non-governmental actors could serve as partners in governments. So the mid-20th century brought a profound transformation in this relationship, in the relationship between civil society and electoral administrations, driven largely by the civil rights movement. Organizations such as the NAACP adopted a multifaceted strategy that combined litigation, legislative lobbying, and mass mobilization. The Supreme Court's decision in Smith v. Allwright in 1944, which invalidated the white primary, exemplified how advocacy groups could use legal mechanisms to dismantle structural barriers to participation. So the Civil Rights Act of 1965 institutionalized many of these efforts. Creating federal oversight mechanisms that directly shaped the work of election administrators. We've seen the Civil Rights Act of 1965 make an appearance in reading after reading. So this is true, but yet, as the chapter notes, even after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, civil society organizations remained critical actors. Groups like the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, Project Vote, and ACORN, which our reading brings up, continue to focus on registration drives and community outreach, often targeting low-income and minority populations. So these efforts reflected a belief that election administration is not value neutral, that the roles governing access to ballots reflect broader strategies over inclusion, equity, and political voice. I'm just going to move this up a bit. I'm trying to avoid it reflecting on my glasses, but it's not working. See if that makes a difference. So when we think of the modern landscape, in recent decades, the landscape of electoral pluralism has expanded pretty dramatically. Technological innovation, party polarization, and major judicial decisions all have altered the ecology of participation. So the 2000 presidential election, which we spent some time 2 weeks ago thinking about and talking about, served as a pivotal moment, revealing deep administrative inconsistencies across states. Remember our earlier readings, and we watched a New York Times video on this about the butterfly ballot and how different states, when they were running their elections, because we know elections are at the local level, oftentimes at the county level, there are some inconsistencies. So in the aftermath of the 2000 presidential election, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, the HAVA of 2002, which modernized voting infrastructure, but also created new opportunities for outside groups to influence election reform debates. So then in 2010, and we spent a lot of time in class talking about this, and we'll see it again later in the semester, the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus FEC redefined the boundaries of permissible political spending. By affirming that corporations, unions, and associations possess First Amendment rights to make independent expenditures, the Supreme Court effectively deregulated much of the campaign finance environment. As a result, the post-Citizens United era witnessed an explosion of new actors: super PACs, 501c4s, social welfare organizations, and politically active nonprofits. Many of these groups began financing election-related advocacy, from voter registration and voter mobilization to litigation and public education. So the chapter, again, chapter 5 from Administering Elections, categorizes these organizations broadly into 3 types. Integrity groups, which focus on protecting election security and administrative capacity. 2, rights-based groups, which seek to expand access to voting and defend participation rights. And 3, partisan or issue-based groups, which pursue electoral or ideological outcomes under the guise of civic administration. So these categories often overlap, but together they illustrate the blurred boundary between public administration, civil society, and partisan politics. So this increasing complex pluralist environment poses a fundamental dilemma for democratic governance. On one hand, third-party engagement can enhance participation, providing valuable information to voters and hold administrators accountable. On the other hand, it can induce bias, partisanship, and inequality in the system. So, an example from the reading. Consider the League of Women's Voters lawsuits against restrictive registration laws in Florida, or the controversies, again from the reading, through the third-party voter registration drives by Acorn. These cases reveal tension between the goal of broad inclusion and the imperative of administrative control. Moreover, as Citizens United amplified the political role of wealthy donors, the pluralist system has become increasingly increasingly complex. Well-financed organizations can shape both policy and public discourse, while smaller volunteer-based groups may struggle to compete. This shift has prompted scholars in political science and practitioners of public policy to question whether the pluralist ideal still functions as intended, or whether it now serves as a bit of a veneer for elite influence. So this chapter, chapter 5 again, suggests that election administrators themselves are increasingly forced to navigate these external pressures, balancing cooperation with civic organizations against the need to maintain neutrality and public confidence. So the Citizens United decision looms large over this discussion. From one perspective, it represents the purest expression of pluralism, the belief that democracy flourishes when diverse groups compete freely in the marketplace of ideas. Yet, in practice, the decision has concentrated political influence among a rather narrow segment of society. Post-2000 campaign finance data reveal that a small number of donors and organizations now account for the vast majority of independent political spending. This outcome aligns with the critiques of pluralism. Left unchecked, tends to magnify inequality rather than dilute it. The Administrating Elections authors frame this as a paradox, a democratic system designed to encourage participation, yet structured in ways that privilege the already powerful. For election administrators, this dynamic raises practical concerns. Outside spending and advocacy can overwhelm administrative capacity, politicize procedural debates, and erode public trust in the neutrality of electoral management. So in conclusion, the pluralist vision of American democracy remains both vibrant and contested. Third-party organizations continue to play large roles in expanding voter participation, monitoring election integrity, and litigating rights-based claims. However, their growth influence also complicates the traditional boundaries between state and society. The central challenge for administrators and for democracy itself is to manage this pluralist ecosystem in ways that preserve both access and legitimacy. So, Chapter 5 closes with an implicit question: can pluralism sustain democracy when resources and influences are so unevenly distributed? So, something for us just to think about that we didn't get to bring up in class, but thank you.